We're looking at chapter 5 in our text that deals with language. So we've looked at the nature of language, the impact of language, and now we look at the last two sections, the gender and language, and lastly, social media and language. So gender and language, let's dive right into it. How extensive are the differences between the way men and women talk? Are there far more similarities than differences, or are there more differences than similarities? And so there are two different approaches. Approach one suggests significant differences. So John Gray, in his book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, in 1992, he argued that men and women are so fundamentally different that they might as well come from two different planets. Okay, so Gray's work is largely anecdotal, no real scholarly support there, but social scientists seem to somewhat agree that men and women do behave differently and communicate differently interpersonally. So these findings have led some scholars to describe males and females as members of two distinct cultures, with their differences arising primarily because of from socialization rather than biology. So it arises from socialization rather than biology. And the best known advocate for this two culture theory is Deborah Tannen. She's written a number of books, well worth reading. She suggests that men and women grow up learning different rules and roles about how to speak and act. So they grow up learning different roles and as a consequence, different rules about how to speak and act. So men are more likely than women to speak in sentence fragments. Men typically talk about themselves a whole lot and use I references and use more judgmental language. They are more likely to use directive statements, as we talked about in the previous video segment. Females, on the other hand, tend to use more tentative, elaborate, and emotional language. So women's sentences are usually longer than men's. Women also make more references to feelings and emotions and use intensive verbs. He's really interested. They paint a more complete verbal picture. And then female speech is usually less assertive. It contains more hedges and uncertainty. It seems to be, you might say, or we kind of set in our ways. And tag questions. Do you think so? Some theorists have argued that such differences cause women's speech to be viewed as less powerful, but more inclusive than men's speech. Approach 2 says that there are minor differences. The link between gender and language isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. And so in some research, women were only slightly more likely than men to use tentative speech, just slightly more likely. When they looked for gender difference in adult talkativeness, affiliative speech, and assertive speech, what they found was that there was negligible differences between men and women in all three constructs. Women use slightly more intensive verbs and personal pronouns than men, and however, participants who read the transcripts were largely unable to identify the speaker's gender. So there are two different approaches to that. There are some non-gender influences on language usage, and one of them is occupation. So male and female athletes have more in common and they communicate similarly. Male daycare teachers speak to their students, male daycare teachers' speech to their students resemble the language of female teachers more closely than it resembles the language of fathers at home. Something else that can trump gender is power. So in gay and lesbian relationships, the conversational style of partners are more linked to power differences in the relationship than to gender differences. There are few differences between the way men and women use threatening speech when they have the same amount of bargaining power in a relationship. Characteristically feminine or masculine speech has been less a function of gender or sex, and more a function of social power. So, differences in social status often show up more clearly in language than do gender differences. So, power seems to trump the gender thing. The last segment, social media and language. Of course, there's a difference between the way we speak when we are speaking in person versus being online. So we tend to be involved in impression management. So we manipulate how we look so that we look impressive, more powerful. Impression management isn't restricted to certain sites like dating websites. Facebook friends also tend to put their best foot forward with strategic language usage. So executives acknowledge that they attempt to manage impressions in the way they write emails. Online language and gender. Men and women have different written language styles, and of course this shows up in online communication. Men tend to use more large words, nouns, and swear words than women do. By contrast, women use more pronouns, verbs, and hedge phrases, as we've talked about. Women are more likely to use what's known as a warm we. We have so much fun together. While men are more inclined toward the distant we. We need to do something about this. It appears that people are intuitively aware of gender differences in online language. One study found that online communicators adopt different writing styles depending on their online gender identities. Participants adapted their language to match linguistic gender stereotype, and so the boys were far more active and assertive, initiating interaction and making proposals, where the girls were more reactive. Wow, OMG, and so on. That's the essence of chapter 5.